I will be showing you how to go from this to this. I would like to thank Ubisoft for providing me access to this game. I will be comparing and benchmarking each major setting for graphics and performance differences so you can better optimize the game for your system. And I will be giving you my optimized settings as well. Let's start by checking the game's CPU performance with an R5 3600X, a mid-range CPU from 2019. Using CPU-intensive settings in a CPU-intensive area, the game averages around 55 to 60 FPS, with the 1% lows dipping to the mid-30s. This seems fair for what's happening, but when using realistic settings, the frame rates never reached these numbers. They were generally around 30 to 40 FPS, which shows just how demanding this game is. It has a very high baseline for entry. For the making of this video, I tested and played the game for a total of around 20 hours, and I can't remember one time where I encountered any noticeable stuttering of any kind, except when testing one experimental future-proof setting, which I will get to later in the video. Basically, the frame times were very smooth during my playtime, which is a miracle for a game of this scope. I am genuinely surprised by this. This is a great sign so far. Keep in mind that I'm talking about frame times, which are different from the frame rates, which are still generally low, as this is a very demanding game. Let's get into the settings, starting with the upscalers. The default native TAA exhibits a small amount of shimmering on foliage. Using XeSS quality exacerbates this problem. FSR3 quality looks very similar to native TAA, which still suffers from visible shimmering, and DLSS quality absolutely knocks it out of the park with how it deals with this issue. In this next scene, during motion, TAA quality suffers from major shimmering around K. Using XeSS, everything becomes shimmery, with a side of extra shimmering around K. Using FSR3 quality, moving the camera causes both the foliage and K to suffer from shimmering, but it settles down gradually when movement stops, and kicks back up when the camera starts moving again. Using DLSS quality, shimmering is only visible briefly around K, and looks to be the least intrusive out of all the upscalers. When enabling ray reconstruction in this game, a couple ray tracing settings are overridden and don't make a difference anymore. So let's take a look at these settings using high and ultra and see what enabling ray reconstruction does. Ray reconstruction definitely improves the look of the game and performs around the same as when using ultra on those overridden ray tracing settings. So from now on, I'm comparing ray reconstruction to the ultra options on those affected settings. Looking at the Stormtrooper, before he looked like a low quality game asset, and after he looks like he came straight from a movie. In this scene, ray reconstruction totally improves the look of the game. Before, it looked like someone smeared Vaseline all over the place. With ray reconstruction, everything now looks clear, and even details that were hidden before are now clearly visible, like the scratches on the floor. This next scene clearly shows how much it improves shading and occlusion. And this scene shows how lighting and shading can blend into the geometry around it. Another thing I noticed was how the foliage now looks a bit different. Before, it looked a bit sharp and dithered, and now it looks a bit softer and smoother. Performance-wise, sometimes it performs the same as when it's turned off, assuming the overridden settings are maxed out, and sometimes it performs slightly lower. Therefore, my recommendation is, if you are already maxing out those settings and your GPU supports ray reconstruction, turn it on immediately. Otherwise, disable it and lower the affected settings for much better performance. Now for depth of field. Low has this ugly bright halo around the focus areas, while high fixes that issue and has a stronger depth of field effect, and high only minimally affects performance, so I recommend high. The camera motion blur intensity setting is straightforward and has a strength value between 0 and 10. It looks decent in this game and doesn't seem to affect performance. As for the per object motion blur setting, it's more complicated than that. Let's start with the obvious. When stationary, moving objects that pass by will have a nice blur effect applied to them, and when the camera is not moving, but the player is, this setting works well and looks quite nice, as can be seen with the foliage here. Now for the ugly part. When moving the camera, and this is exacerbated when maxing out the per object motion blur setting, a blur effect is applied to the world that is similar to the camera motion blur setting but is uglier and definitely doesn't look good to me. This effect can also be seen when riding the speeder bike. However, this issue can be dealt with when using a 5 out of 10 for both the motion blur intensity and the per object motion blur intensity settings. Then it looks mostly good. As always, this is a personal preference setting, and thankfully it can be customized to suit your preference. Now for the experimental future-proof setting that I told you about before, NVIDIA RTX Direct Lighting. I was informed that this setting is only recommended if you have an RTX 4070 GPU or equivalent or higher. This setting offers more accurate lighting and shading, which can be especially observed around light sources. In the open world, however, in this scene, going from off to low doesn't look any different, while still tanking the frame rate, while medium and above look the same, but still perform worse with each increment. It allows for more accurate shadows on some objects, but it started to cause noticeable stuttering and frame drops when enabling this setting. Overall, it's definitely not worth turning on at all. The environment reflection quality setting has a very minimal impact to the image quality, and thankfully, going from low to high doesn't seem to make any noticeable difference to the FPS. Use high here. The fog blur setting adds a very subtle effect to the scene. Here, the trees in the distance become slightly blurrier with it turned on, and I really mean slightly blurrier, because even when editing side by side, I could barely tell the difference. I would say this is more of a personal preference setting, and FPS wise, it doesn't seem to make a difference. The micro detail quality setting adds very small things, like tiny foliage or mushrooms, to specific objects in the world. Going from low to medium adds those objects I mentioned, while high doesn't seem to look any different than medium, and they all perform the same. I recommend medium here. The particle quality setting is a tricky one, because I can't tell the difference between very low, low, or medium, neither graphically nor performance-wise. However, high looks noticeably better, but it also noticeably affects the frame rate. High sometimes lowers the FPS even when it looks like nothing is going on, or maybe something is going on, but the image quality looks the same as the lower quality option, like in this scene here. Therefore, my recommendation is medium. Scatter density affects the foliage density. While low looks a bit empty, medium and above look great, and performance can vary depending on the scene. I recommend medium here. The shadow quality setting is straightforward here. Low has low quality and flickering shadows, while medium and high look very similar to each other. Performance-wise, surprisingly, they all perform basically the same, even when I tested more scenes. Go for high here. The shadow proxies setting is supposed to improve performance by using lower quality geometry for the shadows, but in my testing across many scenes, I found no difference in performance or shadow quality. Even the VRAM usage is the same. I think it's safe to say this setting is currently broken and doesn't work. The spotlight shadows setting affects the number of spotlight shadows that can be seen at once. In this scene, low and medium look the same, while high allows for more shadows to be cast. More interestingly, I found that this setting affected the pop-in of spotlight shadows when entering areas, such as this bar in the beginning of the game. The few and moderate options have obvious pop-in, while the many option doesn't suffer from pop-in. As for performance, many has a minimal impact. I recommend the many option here. The spotlight shadow quality setting incrementally and satisfyingly improves the spotlight shadows. Low and medium and high basically perform the same, while ultra can sometimes perform worse depending on the scene. For a good balance, I recommend high. The deformable terrain quality controls the quality of deformable snow and sand. In this scene, low and medium look the same, while high has improved quality, and ultra looks the same as high. All the options perform around the same, but I suspect high and ultra might perform worse if there are many NPCs. Go for high here. The lens and cinematic effects quality setting can be observed especially during cutscenes, where each setting gradually improves the image quality and the performance cost is very small with each option. I'd go with high for the best balance. The extra streaming distance setting might sound like an afterthought, but in my testing, it looks to be necessary to max this setting out, as the open world looks flat with it disabled, especially given the far open distance landscapes of this game. The performance cost is small but worth it. The object detail setting is very important and very demanding as well. It controls the draw distance and level of detail of objects, foliage, and much more. The impact of this setting can also be observed when using a higher scatter density setting, so keep that in mind. Here, I am testing with the Ultra Scatter Density. By the way, the Ultra preset uses the 200 out of 400 option, so anything beyond that is considered overkill by the developer. More importantly than static scenes, this setting affects the pop-in that can be observed in the world. The values 75 and 100 have noticeable pop-in close to the camera, but perform significantly better than higher option, while 150 looks much better pop-in wise. it impacts the FPS noticeably, and using 200 and above results in unplayable frame rates on my system. For a good balance, I recommend a value of 125. As for the destruction quality setting, I tested many things and wasn't able to determine what this setting affected exactly. Or maybe it just wasn't noticeable. If you know what this setting affects, tell us in the comment section. The spotlight projection resolution setting might be broken and doesn't work. Because I tested many scenes and didn't notice any difference it made, what made me sure it was broken was the image quality of the textures was the same across all options, and the VRAM usage stayed the same as well. The terrain tessellation is self-explanatory, with each option gradually improving the quality of the terrain, except for Ultra, which looks the same as High. This setting also affects the tessellation of the footsteps on the landscape. I recommend to use High. Ray-traced contact shadows on low are non-existent to my eyes. On medium, they start to become visible, and high improves their quality while adding contact shadows to some other objects. Each option has a small FPS impact, but I recommend medium for the best balance. Ray-traced diffuse reflections have a very minor impact to the image quality. I don't even know how to describe what it does, so I will let the video show you. However, in this scene, I noticed that it affected this wall, where on low, it looked completely different than it should. Thankfully, on medium and high, the wall looked just fine. Each option has a minor impact to the FPS. I recommend medium for the best balance. The ray-traced diffuse reflections resolution on medium looks too low-res and exhibits noticeable aliasing, which is dealt with when using high and ultra. Ultra has a very big FPS drop, so use high here. The ray-traced specular reflection setting looks incrementally better with each option, while Ultra looks noticeably better. All the options suffer from shimmering on the reflections. However, Ultra seems to increase the shimmering on more surfaces, ultimately making it look less of an upgrade, and performance-wise, low, medium and high perform similarly, while Ultra has a big FPS drop. Use high for the best balance. The ray-traced specular reflection resolution setting impacts the image quality in general, but it's one of the only settings that affects water reflection quality other than ray reconstruction. Each option gradually improves image quality as expected, and performance-wise, they also gradually lower FPS, but the Ultra setting has a major FPS impact. For the best balance, I recommend medium. Only when using the high option on the BVH quality setting does the image quality look better, and for performance, all the options perform the same somehow. So, for free image quality, use high. Volumetric fog on low and medium look very pixelated and should be avoided at all costs. High looks a lot better, while ultra improves on high, although it can be hard to tell the difference compared to high. Performance-wise, there is an incremental drop with each option, so pick high for the best balance. Volumetric clouds on low look extremely bland. Medium noticeably improves upon low, and high has a less noticeable improvement from medium. This setting also affects the Space Nebula the same way. For performance, each option has an incremental impact. Therefore, use medium for the best balance. Now for the optimized settings, but first let's take a look at the max settings with the NVIDIA RTX Direct Lighting setting, and the performance with this setting is absolutely horrible. Even with it turned off, the game is so demanding that we're getting 10 FPS, up from 2. Now that is a slideshow. Let's take a look at more realistic settings, starting with the max settings at native 1440p DLAA with ray reconstruction on. As you can see, the poor RTX 3060 has no chance here. So, when dropping down to the game's Ultra preset that knocks down a few settings, the game's performance is still abysmal and still unplayable. Switching to the optimized settings, there's a huge improvement, but the frame rate is still under 30 FPS. This GPU has no chance at native 1440p. Therefore, it's only when using DLSS quality that we see significant improvements to the frame rate, to the point where it's now finally playable, averaging around 35 FPS. And taking a look at the VRAM usage, we have dropped from over 11 GB to around 8.5 GB. I can foresee people saying that this game is unoptimized. It's quite the opposite. Take a look at the frame times. They are silky smooth, with no stuttering or spikes at all. And this is when riding around the speeder bike across the map. I know frame times aren't everything, but they are more important than just frame rates. And from my experience, this is indicative of a well-optimized port, but an extremely and technically demanding one at the same time. I just thought you guys should be aware of the game's performance, because most people will not get high frame rates, and I wanted to keep your expectations in check.